Hey viewers, today I'm going to show you how to remove a crank arm, and along the way I'm going to show you the most common ways that the crank arm threads get stripped out and how to avoid those. Now usually there's like a little dust cap on here to help keep dirt and debris and stuff out of the threads in there, but this bike didn't have one when I bought it used. Often it'll be something like this, like a little plastic cap that's kind of pressed on there, and you can use a screwdriver to kind of pry it off to get access to the bolt. But sometimes it might be something like this that's threaded in there, and you could use a coin or a screwdriver to unscrew this. And usually it's not an issue, but occasionally the old ones, the plastic gets brittle and will break up in there, leaving bits of plastic in there. In that case, what I usually do is I'll take like an awl like this and try to work it around counterclockwise to get it to unscrew out of there. Or if it breaks up, I can use this to kind of chip the bits and pieces of plastic into small bits and pieces and work them out of there, but you need to get them out of there in order to be able to remove this bolt. If anybody else has some suggestions of how to get the plastic stuff out of there, go ahead and post it down in the comments. Another type of thing you might find is something like this, in which case the dust seal is integrated in with the bolt. In that case, you can just remove the bolt and you're all set. Now, something I forgot to mention is if you are having to chip the plastic out of there, try to be very careful not to damage the threads. So now I'm ready to remove this bolt. The most common size is like a 14 millimeter socket. So I'm going to use this to unscrew this bolt like that. And then just remove this bolt like that. Now we come to the first major mistake that people make that causes the threads to get ripped out. Sometimes after removing the bolt, there's still a washer left in here. So you have to make sure that you remove this washer, because if you don't, when you go to use the puller, it'll be pushing against this washer inside the crank arm instead of pushing against the end of the spindle. So as you tighten that puller, it'll just get tighter and tighter, pushing against this washer, and eventually it'll rip these threads right out. So check for a washer, and if it's in there, pull it out. So now I'm about ready for a crank puller tool. Now the diameter and threading in the crank arm for the tool is pretty much the same on all crank arms, with a couple of exceptions. Older crank arms made by Specialties or by Stronglight can take a larger diameter tool. I have a video that talks about the pullers for those two crank arms, and I'll include a link down in the description. But the rest are pretty much the same, and so the tool size is pretty standard. Among those, there's a couple variations. There's square taper, which is going to have a square-shaped hole in the bottom, or Octalink/Ices, which have a larger diameter round hole in the bottom. Now, square taper is by far the more common. So the majority of the tools you see are probably going to fit for square taper. This is like the tool that I've used for years and years, and it's got like this one tip on it, and that'll fit down in against the spindle on the square taper arm. Now this tool here has two tips and will work for both square taper and Octalink. Now this brings to point a mistake that some people make that causes the threads to strip out. If you use this larger diameter tip meant for Octalink on a square taper crank arm, this big tip is not going to fit down into the square hole to go against the spindle. It's going to go against the inside of the crank arm, and as you tighten the tool in, it's just going to rip those threads out. So you got to make sure you use the smaller tip for square taper. So on this particular tool, the tips are interchangeable. So I take the larger tip off, take the smaller tip off this end here. It kind of pops off like this. I can pop it down into place here. It kind of snaps on, and then put this back into place like that. And so now I have the smaller tip in place, and that will fit into the square hole against the square spindle like that. Now when using a crank puller tool, it's important to try to get as many threads on the tool engaged with the threads in the crank arm. If you have too few threads engaged and you try to remove that crank arm, there's a good chance that you're going to just rip those threads out. So you want to try to get good engagement. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to retract this tip fully into the tool, because if I leave it out like this and I try to screw this tool in, it's going to bottom out and I might not get enough threads engaged. So first thing is fully retract the tip into the tool. Now, some other things that you might encounter, other problems, is if you try to screw this in, you want to be careful not to cross thread it. It should thread in fairly easily, at least at the beginning, to where you get it in and you shouldn't have to force it. Now, one problem you might encounter is that the threads in the crank arm get gummed up with like debris, especially if the cap was not on there like it was on this one. So you'll want to use a thread chaser to clean those out. There was a company that used to make a thread chaser, but they stopped selling that. So I have a video on how to make a thread chaser for a crank arm like this, and I'll include that in the description. So I'm going to go ahead and clean these threads out with a thread chaser. This is my homemade thread chaser for a crank arm. It's basically part of a crank puller, but I cut some little notches in there. So what I'll do is I'm going to thread this in, and again, I want to make sure that it's nice and straight, and those little notches in there will help kind of clean out the threads in there, clean the debris out of there, so that when I tighten the tool in there, it will get good thread engagement. So a little bit cleaner out there like that. So now I can try threading my puller in there. Again, I want to make sure that it's nice and straight and not cross-threaded. Screw in fairly easily, at least at the beginning there. And I want to make sure that it's fully threaded in. And then I can use a wrench to just kind of like make sure that it is. I don't want to like, if I hit where it feels like the bottom of the threading there, then I'll stop. So I don't want to use too much force. And right there, it feels like I hit the bottom of the threading in the crank arm. So at this point, I can go ahead and screw this part in to where against the spindle. Generally, I don't need to, but I usually like to hold the tool with a wrench, but usually it's kind of tightening into the arm, so it doesn't matter. And I'll use another wrench against this part of the tool, and then just tighten that part into the crank arm against the spindle. And then this can be kind of tight. And then that will pull the crank arm off the spindle like that. So now at that point, I can use the tool to, like my wrench here, to remove the tool from the crank arm. And so that is how to remove a crank arm and minimize the chances of ripping the threads out. So hopefully you found that useful or interesting. If you did, please give my video a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed to my channel, click the subscribe button, click that bell so you get notified when new videos come out. I'm over on Facebook, RJ the Bike Guy. Go over to check that page out. I post a ton of stuff over there. And I have a webpage, rjthebikeguy.com. Go check that out. Thank you guys very much for watching.